Tio's book, which has just been released, I think, about a month or two ago. And it's a really tumultuous period that your book is releasing in the middle of a pandemic. Dr. Liu teaches history at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. And I understand that you've had most of your undergraduate and graduate education in Columbia University in New York, from where you got your doctorate. If I can just take this from your bio on your university website, that your research interest is analyzing modern Chinese history in a global and comparative context. And also that you are more broadly interested in social theory, political economy and labor, the history of technology, modern South and East Asia, and the methods of comparative and global history. So that's really a very broad area of interest, yeah. So anyway, a very warm welcome again to you. Now, I just want to go over how we will be conducting today's session. We will ask Dr. Liu to speak for about 30 minutes. And maybe I'll just begin by posing one or two questions, and then you can go from there. And after that, we hope to have about maybe 45 minutes of an open session where participants can ask questions of the speaker. If you do want to ask, if you do want to ask questions, please use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom app. And also you can also use the chat option if you prefer. And please ensure that you are muted, you remain mute through, except when you need to speak if you have to ask a question, because that will help to cut out any ambient noise. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. So can I begin by, before you really start on your the subject, can you explain to us like how you decided to and why you decided to study India and China, the tea industries conjointly together? Because usually these are studied separately. I wish I could say I had read your book, but I haven't been able to, except I've got some tantalizing previews online. And I've also read your excellent article in the Journal of Asian Studies on the historiographies of capitalism in China and South Asia. So I have some idea of what your areas, your interests have been, but I'd really like to know, why you decided to take these two countries together and study what's your larger objective in comparing these two? Because we do have a greater number of studies in the last few years which look at China and India together, but they mostly focus on the present and sometimes on the very ancient past, but rarely in this period which you are dealing with, which is really the 19th and early 20th century, which is also my area of interest in India and China. So if you could begin by explaining how you came to this, and then follow it up with introducing, talking about this topic, and especially, why you chose the title Tea War. I guess that sums up the essence of your whole topic. So please go ahead and.
So thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks everyone for attending. So Professor Tampi is correct. This book came out about 1 or 2 months ago in the United States. I'm not sure what the progress is in releasing it in the Indian market. I hope it does obviously get released. If it doesn't, in any time soon, it is available in some form unofficially on the internet. So hopefully people could, if you're interested, it's possible to read parts of the argument. So I do want to, I was actually planning on beginning with those questions, Professor Tampi, about how I became interested in this topic and how I started thinking about this topic. Just to briefly give a roadmap of what I'll talk about, since I'm not going to do a slideshow. So I do want to talk about how I became interested in this topic, China India connections. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the basic facts about the dates and the time periods and what are the major events that this book covers. And then I'll kind of delve more deeply into the argument of the book. At this point, I'll be kind of delving into historiography. And I know not everyone is a historian, so I'll try to kind of keep it accessible, but also not oversimplify it either. And the last thing I want to talk about is to perhaps delve a little bit deeper into some of the specific arguments, and specifically my interest in thinking about labor in the tea industry of China and the labor in the tea industry of India in this time period. So first, how I became interested in this topic. It's there's like multiple ways to think about this. There's always the topic, and there's also the broader, like, how did you what were you thinking when you entered graduate school or undergraduate, all these kind of broader questions. I entered my PhD program. I applied by kind of saying I wanted to study Chinese history, but I wanted to study it in a global context. And luckily for me, or fortunately or unfortunately, I was placed into a program that I didn't know existed called Global History at Columbia. And so my advisor and the whole program was always encouraging all of its students to think beyond a single place, China or Japan or India. So that was always, I think, that was never the problem in graduate school. It's actually, I only kind of subsequently realized that most the history discipline or social scientists, some may have like not difficulty, but a problem with that type of approach. But in graduate school, it was always encouraged. And the reason I was interested in that is because, to get a little personal, I think my parents' generation, my family's from Taiwan, and I always grew up in the United States, kind of with this impression that Chinese history was really boring, and it was really traditional and very stiff. It was, like XYZ dynasty, 5,000 years of continuous culture and civilization, and I always this is getting maybe too personal. I didn't really like that, and I didn't like hearing those types of stories. But at the same time, as I was becoming interested in academia and interested in studying, finding some point to locate myself in the world, to study the rest of the world, I thought it would be, I was personally curious about China and East Asia. And so I figured I might as well study this place, but I wanted to do it a different way than the sort of traditional nationalist way that I think my parents' generation would talk about it. And it actually turned out that I initially became interested in history and academia, not through Chinese history, but actually I took a class as an undergraduate, kind of not intentionally. I kind of stumbled into it on modern South Asia, on modern Indian history. It was taught at Barnard College at Columbia by a woman named Anupama Rao, who she just introduced the topic in a way that made me think I could perhaps do history also, which is to say that I was always interested in history. I always liked history classes, but I was also at the time becoming interested in thinking about social theory, thinking about bigger questions about like power and colonialism and capitalism, and I thought I might have to study and just like what is going on in the world, right? And I tried political science, I tried things with sociology, anthropology, or whatever. And it really struck me that the South Asia history field, and I think in hindsight, I think it was really, the South Asia history field was probably very singular in this regard. It was very interested in these big questions, right? And this is early 2000s, so this is a time when subaltern studies and post-colonial theory, which I know kind of has a different trajectory in the North America versus in India itself. But at least in North America, these were the big debates that were happening. And I thought it was very attractive to be able to talk about history, but also to engage these larger debates about colonialism, power, capitalism, gender, race, caste, labor. So it was really South Asian studies in a lot of ways that gave me a lot of my orientation and trying to think about history in theoretically sophisticated ways that I've kind of spent most of my very young career trying to bring that to Chinese history, because I think for the most part, Chinese history remains methodologically a little conservative for various reasons. I think it has a lot to do with the kind of Cold War approach of the North American Academy that tries to always kind of um, um, uh, soften the political edge of Chinese studies, which we could talk about later. But Chinese history has always kind of seemed to me you're either stuck in the very nationalist framework or a very Eurocentric framework. And so I think a global or comparative historical approach um, hopefully helps us move beyond that. And then as far as the specific topic, so as Professor Tampi said, I'm talking about the tea trade of China and the tea trades of India. How did I get to this specific topic? So in those classes as an undergraduate, I had this very vivid memory. Took a class on India, then took a class on China. In each class, there was at least one day that I'm sure everyone knows about this, the sort of opium for tea trade triangle of the 18th and 19th century that's coordinated by the British Empire, buying opium from India, initially Eastern India, but then Western India, bringing it to China, selling opium to China, buying tea from China, bringing it back to Britain, right, and so on and so on. And this, of course, precipitates the Opium War of 1839 to 1842. I had this very vivid memory that in the Indian history class, there would be a little bit about this trade triangle, but so a little bit about China. And then in the Chinese history classes, they would do this trade triangle, talk a little bit about India. But of course, the India historians don't exactly know too much about China and vice versa. So I thought that would be an interesting thread to kind of like pull on and see where it goes. I looked at opium for a bit, but I kind of was just surprised and kind of pleasantly surprised to discover that the story of tea was also very interesting. And not a lot of people had written about it in a connected sense, looking at them together. But once again, I discovered that it was actually quite South Asia, historians based in South Asia who had raised a lot of the interesting questions about this history. There's a couple of historians in Delhi, in fact, Rana Behal and Prabhu Mohapatra, both at Delhi University, or the Delhi University system, that kind of pioneered the study of Chinese or Indian tea from the perspective of labor in a theoretically interesting way starting in the 1980s. And Rana's book, the sort of big book on this topic, just came out a few years ago, and I've been in frequent conversation with both Rana and Prabhu about this topic, so they've been a great help. And so once again, it was a case where I kind of had a lot of questions sparked by the South Asia historians that I tried to kind of bring to the China field, and then back and forth, right, and see what happens when you put these two together. So I kind of landed upon this topic. I did research in Shanghai, Beijing. I visited the tea growing areas, and tea is grown and drunk all over China, right? So it's hard to narrow it down. I'm specifically looking at the export tea trade, right? The places that specialize in tea, first, what we would call green tea, and then oolong tea, and then black tea that gets exported from Fujian province and Anhui province, right? Those are the primary areas. And then on the India side, it's, there's many regions, but primarily Assam is the kind of creation of the East India Company and the British imperial state and is still, the heart of the tea industry of India. So I did research in Delhi, research in Kolkata. I did visit Assam briefly, but for the most part, research was conducted kind of in the urban archive areas. So that's kind of a basic how I became interested in the topic. Let me kind of briefly describe some of the facts, just in case not everyone here is familiar with the history. So the book, in short, kind of begins from the Opium War and traces this to World War II, just as a sort of convenient endpoint for the story. Some basic details about what is going on with tea and Indian tea and Chinese tea. So Chinese tea was it was long a beverage, a commodity that was enjoyed in China, but it kind of takes on this life of its own in the 1700s, the 18th century. People have heard of the so-called Canton trade system, where first the Dutch, then primarily the British, but traders from all over Western Europe come to Canton, right, Guangzhou in the south, to purchase silk, porcelains, and then eventually tea as this commodity they can bring back to Western Europe and make a lot of profit off of. And this is kind of this birth of global capitalism moment, and China is participating in it. And then eventually, as I just mentioned, in order to purchase the tea from China, the British, the East India Company, which is at the same time, of course, begun to kind of establish a foothold and then gradually colonize Eastern India, then the rest of Northern India. They pioneer this system where they are, what's the word? They're coercing, let's say, the production of opium in Eastern India, then Western India. So they create the system where they get opium from India, sell it to China, bring it to China. At the time, the Qing Empire, right, is becoming concerned about how much opium is flowing into the country. They try to enforce this ban upon the opium trade. The British East India Company officials perceive this as illiberal, right? This is against their classical liberal views of free trade, Adam Smith influenced ideas. So it's under the under this aegis of free trade, right? Not about selling drugs, right? It's about free trade that the British declare war on China to destroy this monopoly. And then very famously, once they destroy this, quote unquote, destroy this monopoly and establish this treaty port system in China, opium imports and tea exports in China explode and reach a new level in the second half of the 19th century. So that's kind of a well-known story. But at the same time, what people perhaps are less familiar with is at the same moment in the 1830s, we have East India Company officials in Eastern India, right in Calcutta, which is the home base at the time. They are also talking about, this is the language they use, annihilating and destroying the Chinese monopoly by creating a British tea industry, right, in their colony of India, right? So they're using the exact same language of destroying a monopoly, right, that they used to justify the Opium War, to justify the Indian tea industry. And they settle upon Assam, which at the time was only very recently kind of integrated into the British Empire. Indian Empire was kind of its own, it was its own state for a long time. And so I argue that we could think of the Indian tea industry and its origins as basically the Opium War by other means, right? And so we have from the 1830s and 40s onward this turning point in both China and Indian tea history, which we have this kind of skyrocketing of production and sales. And the Indian tea industry takes a few decades to take off. It's until independence in the 1940s, it's almost entirely owned and managed by British officials. And then there's kind of a gradual transfer to Indian ownership. And so the tea war that the title of this book comes from is kind of a play on this notion of an opium war. There's a tea war, which I think is kind of the sequel, let's say, to the Opium War. And in particular, I am quoting a British official who uses this phrase, the tea war, to describe throughout the 19th century there's kind of a back and forth where the Chinese tea trade explodes and they dominate global sales of tea. The British in India are explicitly trying to catch up with and topple the Indian side, or the Chinese side, I'm sorry. And then once they do succeed and they catch up, and then the Chinese side, becomes aware of this competition and they try to fight back. And this notion of competition, I think, is actually at the heart of, it's what keeps the story together, for one thing, right? This notion that this side is looking at that side is looking at this side. And there's also conceptual theoretical component that, and trying to conceptualize China and India as belonging to this concept, this category of capitalism in the 19th century. I'm also making an argument that capitalism, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I think you could argue that, I'm trying to argue that competition is at the heart of what capitalism is about, even till today. And if you think about it that way, then certainly the China and India are part of the global division of labor and global sort of arena of capitalist competition. So I try to foreground competition as this process. So it's at the same time in the 18th and 19th century where you have a lot of these classic stories of the birthplace of global capitalism with particular commodities. You have cotton and sugar from North America. You have textiles from Britain and Western Europe and Northern United States. You have opium, obviously from India, silver, porcelain, silk. And added to all this is Chinese tea, which is by far the most exported commodity out of China throughout the 19th century. And Indian tea, which is, if not the number one commodity, it is by some metrics within the Indian economy, the colonial economy of the 19th and 20th century, the commodity that has the most registered companies, the most investment from overseas, and what historian Samita Sen calls the most spectacularly successful colonial enterprise. And by the 1930s, this was something I was kind of surprised to discover. The first kind of labor surveys of China and India are taking place in the 1930s, and and there are more people connected to the tea trade as employees or sort of casually employed in tea than in any of the urban industries of China or India, right? So like silk in Shanghai or jute in Calcutta, right? So those are classic where you would, if you were to study the history of capitalism, you would classically look at sort of textiles in the city, right? To kind of model off of English, cotton textiles. But in fact, tea had more workers than those. So in fact, I think I just kind of begin by saying like tea should be certainly considered central to any attempt to write the history of capitalism in either of these places. It was the kind of major commodity. So those are some of the basic facts. Okay, so I might be going over 30 minutes, but I'll try to kind of talk about the rest concisely. So what then am I exactly trying to argue in the book itself? So if you excuse me, I apologize, but I'll be reading a few sentences from the book just to hopefully say it as concisely, as precisely as I want to say. So from the introduction of the book, I make several claims. I argue that this book sets out to tell the story of the global tea trade as a history of emergent capitalism in modern China and India through a history of economic life and economic thought. This book challenges past depictions of Asian stagnation and also accounts for how these ideas were naturalized in the first place at the turn of the 20th century. Tea War demonstrates how the producers, merchants, and planters of the Chinese and Indian hinterlands were connected through overlapping circuits of accumulation, as well as pressures towards intensive production, shared in common with the rest of the industrial world. Right? So I'm trying to kind of reconnect it with this kind of typical history of urban industry, but by thinking about this unexpected location of the Asian hinterlands, like rural China, rural India, of all places, is actually experiencing a lot of the same dynamics and social patterns, right, as the familiar places we think of where industry takes place. So the goals of the book, of course, are, to connect these two places together, to frame them in dynamic and global terms. And the structure of the book is kind of a back and forth, where I begin with a chapter in China, I jump to India. After the Indian tea industry kind of takes off, I jump back to China, look at what is the reaction back in China, and so on and so on. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. There's a story where the competition itself is kind of leading the story. And so competition for me is an argument for how to understand capitalism. And it's also the way that I structure the book itself. So in terms of what am I trying to do with the book, I'm making some interventions into established history writing. And I know not everyone is a historian, so I'll try to be as accessible about this as possible. One very obvious model for writing this history is this kind of economic history model, which tends to be the social science of economics being applied to history, which is to say, a lot of times historians will try to take this category, we call it GDP today, economic growth, economic performance, and kind of chart the rise and fall of different countries and what was their economic growth, what was their performance throughout history using basic quantitative measures. And then once that is established, historians kind of look back and say, well, why was England able to grow so much in the 1800s? Why was China unable to grow in the 1800s? And they just kind of use these quantitative measures as their basis. So in fact, let me briefly share. I begin the book. Okay. So can everyone see the shared screen now? Okay, so I begin the book I think this is the second or third page of the book with this chart, which tells you the basic story that, China initially has this boom of tea exports, and then by the turn of the 20th century, as Indian exports rise, Chinese exports fall. So there's a very clear sort of X, Y, or X X pattern. One rises and falls, the other one continues to rise, and um, that's just like the basic facts to know the story about what I'll talk about in the rest of the book. But this is also, I think, kind of a chart that typically we use to talk about the modern world, as the rise of the West and the fall of the East, right? And curiously, like India is now seen as the rise of the West because it's a British-run industry, and the British ownership saw themselves as using Western methods, right? Even though they're in Assam. Uh, and um, Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work, The Great Divergence by Kenneth Pomerantz, who kind of takes this basic premise of the rise of the West, but then kind of challenges it and talks about why it's not exactly correct. And I think I kind of share the same spirit, if not the same methodology as Pomerantz is saying. This is how we can begin by thinking about what happened, but we have to kind of go beyond it. Um, and I point this out because I spent some time on this because I think it's not just economic historians or economists who are using this sort of horse race or this competition as the way to think about the world. There was materials at the time from the turn of the 20th century, especially from the British side, where they were constantly thinking about this as a competition between two rivals, right? The Chinese versus the Indian tea industry. So this is an advertisement or a illustration from a book published by the Indian Tea Association, which is based, is a British tea association, very clearly thinking about, how China used to be on top and how India has risen and defeated it with all the sort of typical Orientalist flair you would expect from the time. And here's an advertisement also published by the Indian tea industry, I believe, in an American magazine at the time. But again, thinking about this as a direct competition, right, between two rivals. And in this case, this is also talking about Japan and Ceylon who have also entered the competition, but it's primarily China and India are the main entities. So that is one that would have been like an obvious way to frame the book. Like why did one rise and why did one fall, and why is one so virtuous and one is so flawed and so on. And but I argue that 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 is not this sort of economic history approaches, right? This sort of applying economics to history is not the right approach. For one thing, you wind up, even though they connect different parts of the world, what happens is you wind up emphasizing these differences across the world rather than their connections, right? Like why is, what is it about British culture, British and Indian culture versus Chinese culture? Without seeing how these places are kind of borrowing from each other and looking towards each other at the same time. And the second problem with this, and the deeper problem, is that this economics approach is ahistorical, right? It takes this very modern category like GDP or economic growth, and it projects it into the past, and it assumes that everyone at the time was always thinking about how to make the most modern industrial method to sell as much stuff as possible. So it takes for granted that everyone was always a capitalist, when I'm in fact interested in this question of how does capitalism as a system, as a social structure, emerge in these places in the first place. So I think that's the historian question, whereas the economist question would be about, what are the factors behind growth? So really, I think my project could be thought of as part of this broader project that is becoming circulating, at least in the United States, in the North American Academy, and I'd be curious to hear if this is also the case in the South Asian Academy. This category known as the history of capitalism that has begun to emerge in the last 10 years or so, and it's primarily a field that is about the U.S. history and European history, and I would like to see it extend to Asia for very obvious reasons. If we're going to talk about capitalism, what places are more interesting to explore than Asia itself, right? Not just China, but also India and the entire region, right? Which is undergoing lots of transformations in the last few decades. And so unlike economic history, which kind of has this very ahistorical, anachronistic view of human behavior, the history of capitalism is trying to say, how do we historicize the world we live in? How did capitalism emerge in the first place? And I think that's the question I'm more interested in, rather than this question of performance and growth. Now, this history of capitalism, of course, is this history of capitalism. This buzzword is relatively kind of revived in the last 10 years for various reasons, but of course, it's a very old question also, right? Dating back to the early 20th century, mid 20th century debates among sort of socialist historians, Marxist historians, or just people kind of interested in revolution and how do societies change over time. That historiography, even though that historiography was interested in the whole world, including India and China, the framework and the approach, I believe, was always Eurocentric, right? Which is to say that it kind of took as its model what happened in England and the northern US, the sort of proletarianization and industrialization and mechanization of textiles, I guess the textile industry should be the classic case, and then other sectors. That becomes the sort of model by which other societies get measured. And so one of the goals of my book is to look at Chinese tea and Indian tea, which are undeniably major industries involved in the global market, global division of labor, but neither of which look like the sort of English Northern United States model of industrialization. How does this history challenge and force us to open up how we think about capitalism? How do we conceptualize it? Specifically then, I think the older framework in particular was tied to this basic assumption that capitalism is about proletarianization, right? The creation of an independent workforce that for various reasons it is necessary for industrialization and technological advances in different societies around the world. But really, the argument, and this is for those who have studied this before, this is a very classic argument that proletarianization is defined by people not being tied, no longer being tied to the land, and then B, people not being bound to any master, which is to say, not a peasant, not a slave, not a serf, and so on, right? Being a sort of independent employee of an employer, something that we take for granted today. But at the time in the 19th century, you could think of this as basically there's Western Europe and the Northern US, where proletarianization is very widespread, or becoming more widespread, versus the rest of the world. And this is one of the arguments for why, you can think of this as sort of classic Orientalist argument, right? For why Western Europe is able to advance and the rest of the world, such as China and India, and not to mention America and Africa, are unable to advance. And of course, Asia, especially, is it's until the 20th century is basically a society founded upon the peasant, founded upon agrarian life. And so it's kind of automatically excluded from this definition of capitalism a priori. So I became interested in this body of work that is known as global labor history. And again, it's South Asia historians who kind of pioneer this approach. And I mentioned Nana and Prabhu, who they were all one sort of the early people thinking about the Indian tea industry as this challenge to the classic model of industrialization and labor history that kind of led people to think about, well, what about not just indentured labor, but peasant labor and sharecropping and bondage and all these other sort of non-classic forms. And I think this body of literature is very much inspired by the history of capitalism as it's developed in Asia since the late 20th century, where with what this process of people have known as like globalization, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, has led to a lot more parts of the world are being involved in the global market than ever before, but they're not all being transformed in a classic way. You have all sorts of businesses, subcontracting relationships, right, that are connecting like the North Atlantic world to the Asian world, where people are making commodities under conditions that are deregulated, informal, semi-independent, coerced, paternalistic, where people are making commodities in their living room, if not in a factory, in the fields, right, if not in an urban space. Basically, capitalism is a lot more diverse and flexible than the classic models assumed. And I think the history of the tea is a particularly useful starting point, because what happens is, again, tea is this major, from a quantitative standpoint, tea is a major contributor to the global marketplace. But if you look more specifically at the conditions in China and India, you have in China, basically the tea industry is organized around landowning peasants and seasonal casual labor. That is basically they own land, but they work a little bit in this every spring or every season. And that is not supposed to be what capitalism looked like. You're supposed to be divorced from the land and like forced into the city, but that's not what's happening in China. And in India, in Assam, you have this very famous story of indentured labor, where the British imperial state is unable to, or the colonial state is unable to kind of get locals in Assam to grow tea, or to hire themselves to grow tea for British employers. So they passed legislation that is very much based on these kind of 15th, 16th century laws about masters and servants, to justify the indenture, the recruitment of workers from across Eastern India and Central India, bringing them to Assam in the Northeast and putting them under these penal labor contracts where the employees are unable to leave and can be put into prison and punished, however severely, with impunity, if they are said to break the contract. And this is a very, in crude terms, it's very feudal, right? It's barbaric. It's a very old-fashioned, not a very modern employee-employer relationship whatsoever. And this is also supposed to be incompatible with capitalism, right? And this is, the analogy here is, there are many famous debates about whether or not African slavery in the United States or the Americas, was that capitalist or was that not capitalist? Today, it seems like the consensus is pretty clear that it was part of the capitalist system. And I think, but for many years, it was assumed that because the workers were not free, that cannot be considered capitalist. And I think I'm kind of making a similar argument here, that for many years, it was assumed that these indentured workers were in a non-capitalist, feudal, backwards employment system. But in fact, if you just kind of look at the basic big picture, of course it was capitalist. Of course, these were workers producing commodities that creates economic value that contributes to the global accumulation of capital, in the hands of not just the British, but also Indian merchants, Chinese merchants, and overseas investors into the Indian tea industry. So in many ways, I'm just trying to explode the very narrow concept of what capitalism was in the classic literature and kind of bring that to bear upon China and India, as case studies or entry points into this larger discussion. I think one of my goals, Professor Tampa, you asked about what are my goals of the book. I think one of the goals is to use tea as an entry point into thinking about more broadly Chinese history, Indian history, and perhaps a history of the post-colonial world that methodologically was always kind of excluded from this concept of capitalism. I won't get into, I know I'm kind of running against the time limits here, so I want to just briefly perhaps share a few more images. Let's see. So again, these are images from the book. And then in the content chapters of the book, I look more closely at what are the processes of tea cultivation and manufacture and packaging and distribution. What do those actually look like on the ground, and how do they get transformed over time by this international competition that is distinctly modern in character? So in the Chinese case, I make an argument that in these tea districts, one is in Fujian province called the Wuyi Mountains in northwest Fujian. The other is a region called Huizhou in southern Anhui province. But if you look at a map, they're connected. They are this mountainous area that's connected across provinces. In these regions, you don't have mechanization. You don't really have cutting edge technologies. But I argue that doesn't really matter, because you do have very modern dynamics that emerge where, for instance, the merchants and the managers who oversee production are developing a very modern notion of time, labor that's attached to time and efficiency, where workers' tasks of like burning the leaves and roasting the leaves and rolling the leaves, each of these individual tasks becomes bound to fixed abstract units of time similar to the way that we today will say, um, not academic so much, but like more sort of service or manufacturing labor will say, make 10 widgets per hour. If you don't make 10 widgets per hour, we're going to pay you less. If you make more than 10 widgets per hour, we'll pay you more. And that itself, that is already emerging, even if technology is not necessarily changing in China. You also have these other phenomenon of those modern recruitment and mobilization of workers and coordination, sort of a division of labor and broader workshop environment that coordinates these activities of plucking leaves, roasting leaves, rolling leaves, and having them work together as a team and coordinating them in a sort of proto-industrial manner. So these are some of these images from the turn of the 20th century. These are tea peasants in China who have plucked leaves, and now they're at a local marketplace. So all those bags you see on the image are bags of raw leaves, and they're about to try to sell them to the little manufactories, workshops in town that are going to further roast those leaves and process them. This is what a manufactory supposedly looks like, right? These are kind of stage photographs from the turn of the 20th century. You can tell by the fact that they're all looking at the camera, but this is kind of gives you a sense of they do have this proto-industrial, like coordinated workshop feel to them, where everyone is kind of roasting on a schedule, working side by side and in a coordinated manner. You have rolling that's next to the roasting, and it's set up that way. And then for a lot of these activities, you don't necessarily have good photographs, so we have to rely upon these watercolors, which again are very romanticized and mythologized, but this does give you a sense of, this would be in the treaty ports, like in Shanghai or Fuzhou or Guangzhou in the south, where you can see in the foreground, you have Europeans with top hats, right, doing business with Chinese merchants wearing sort of traditional Qing outfits, and that's in the foreground, but in the background, you see these teams of workers busily packing leaves, weighing leaves, and taking them out to the ship. So there is a, if you just kind of forget about like steam engines and electricity and just kind of think about what does a modern factory look like, these images very early on begin to resemble what we have, what the imagery we would have of industry in our heads. So similarly in India, again, you don't really have mechanization until the 20th century in India. The British would always talk about, we're going to bring this modern science to the Indian industry and modernize it and revolutionize it. But in fact, it was quite labor intensive, just like the Chinese tea industry was labor intensive. So a big part of my argument is that even though capitalism and industrialization has tended to be equated with revolutionary technology, I think what happens in Asia and probably in most of the world is that the first major thing that happens is with capitalism is labor intensification, right? That the activities of human labor become coordinated and reshaped in accordance with market demands. And that is certainly taking place in China and in India. And so what happens in the Indian industry is you have, and I also I do make an argument eventually for why India was able to surpass the Chinese industry at the turn of the 20th century. It's not because they were more modern. It's not because they were more rational. A big part of it was the fact that ironically, precisely because the British Indian industry was using these kind of so-called pre-capitalist, feudal, unfree labor laws, it was those unfree labor laws that allows the Indian industry to thrive eventually, because those laws, for one thing, they fix the rates of the wages at one half what they would have had to pay in a free market system. And once the workers are brought into the system, they are treated with impunity, kind of pushed to their limits, working, longer and harder than they would normally in a free system. So the irony here is that it's the unfreedom of the Indian tea industry that enables them to surpass the Chinese tea industry. It wasn't their modern, progressive, rational aspects. It was the unfree and quote unquote backwards aspects that allows them to thrive. And again, that's of course a broader commentary on the origins of capitalism around the world. It's not just in India, but also think about the history of slavery. These are some of the most profitable and economically significant industries of the 19th and 20th century, and they're founded on ideals that seem to be in direct contradiction to what political economy would have dictated at the time. So this is an image of these so-called
Can
quote
we go
unquote tea.
quiet
Yeah,
2 minutes and then
yeah, yeah. So these
carry
are
on with the
so
questions?
this is an image of like quote unquote tea coolies being clearing the land for a new tea plantation. Right, this is a plantation system in India, and this image is useful not because it's accurate, but it does give you a sense of the sort of fantasy that British planters had, that they would kind of replace all the human labor with this mechanization. But in fact, up until today, mechanization has not really happened in the tea industry. It's still a very labor intensive process. As anyone who drinks tea knows, right, it's a very delicate product. You can't just use a crude machine to pluck and roll these things. The final thing I'll say is that I won't talk about this today, but everything I've talked about is sort of the first half of the book. The second half of the book is actually kind of an intellectual history where I think about economic thought in China and in India, and in particular, the way that British, Chinese, and Indian writers were trying to understand the tea trade is an entry point into this broader question of economic thought in China and India. And this, again, is also part of this tradition of historicizing capitalism by historicizing how people think about the economy. And that's its own kind of different history. But in short, I argue that these Chinese writers, these Indian writers, I look at a lot of writings, Bengali writers, plays, novels, speeches, where they are beginning to articulate notions about labor, value, production in ways that really resemble what is known as classical political economy in Western Europe, basically the school of Adam Smith onwards, to show that even though these are places that look nothing like England, they are grasping the basic abstract dynamics of the marketplace and the economics in a way that is recognizable to, say, an Adam Smith, right, in Western Europe. So that, again, is another way to say that these places look very different than the classic sites of industrial capitalism. But at a more abstract level, they are all kind of being pulled together and pulled apart by similar social dynamics of competition and the demand for greater productivity for the marketplace. So I could talk about that. People want to have questions about it, but ultimately the goal of this exploration of labor, exploration of economic thought, is about opening up this category of capitalism by looking at China, by looking at India, by looking at the post-colonial world, but also keeping the notion of capitalism, trying to keep it coherent, right? Not just saying like, let's do away with the concept, but kind of broadening it to account for these new experiences that I think at this point, in the year 2020, are sort of undeniably a part of the history of capitalism. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, it's been an extraordinarily rich and a very bold
Thank you.
research project, because what I see you doing is really as transcending many boundaries. There's the boundaries between Chinese history and Indian history, which usually it's just not, they're seen as two separate worlds. That, and then within the study of capitalism, to look at how India and China are part of this, capitalist system and the evolution of the capitalist system. Usually, as you try to point out, they're seen as some backwater of capitalism, but they're really at the heart of the whole growth of the capitalist system. And then even within, I think, business history or business studies, you look at labor, which is not usually done. So you have again transcended certain boundaries. Anyway, I wish we had more time than this. But I really urge people, whenever they can get hold of the book, to read it, and then we would be able to understand your insights better. I would, before I open it up, I would like you to very briefly, maybe in 3-4 minutes, just explain your sources, because I mean, this is such a vast and diverse field. And where did you get your sources from? And I remember that you talked about in your book about the Jiang family archive in China.
Right.
It's very important to your work. Did you find anything similar in India, or can you just talk, but just for about three,
Yeah.
4 minutes, and then I'll open it to the.
Yeah. So I went to archives. I was very, privileged, of course, to have, the support and of these grants and fellowships to go to the UK, parts of China, parts of India. Did a little work in Taiwan when where my family is, uh, because they have very good libraries there. Um, the India side was quite straightforward. It's National Archives, West Bengal State Archives. But part of me was also very,
I
what's the word?
understand you know Bengali also. You learned Bengali.
Right. Yeah. So I did. I was very like, this is perhaps the Chinese East Asian studies influence, where it's not okay just to use English to write about Asia.
Mm.
So I thought I should learn some sort of Indian language, even if the sources are almost always in English, because it is a British industry. But for the most part, I did a summer and some language classes in Bengali and Bangla and Kolkata, and with the help of instructors, I was able to work my way through some Bangla literature, which is the basis for one chapter where I look at some plays by nationalists in the late 19th century, talking about the scandal of labor indenture. And again, this is where the economic thought dimension comes into play. Like, on what grounds are these Indian economists and nationalists criticizing indenture? They're arguing that it's unfree. Well, how do they get this notion of freedom in capitalism, and so on and so forth? So, and I really felt like by the end of it, there was so much more one could do. I know Bodhisattva Kar, he's in South Africa somewhere. He's looked at Assamese sources, which I think is probably the way to go in the future. And I don't have that capability, but I think the English language version of the India side is pretty clear at this point, and I think Indian language sources would really help flesh out that story. In China, I looked at, unlike India, the archives are not very good in China, at least before the 20th century. So a lot of it was about kind of scrounging around, looking for early 20th century publications that um, are used a lot by China historians, but are kind of problematic because you can't really project those things backwards. As Professor Tampi mentioned, one kind of breakthrough was I discovered that some historians in Anhui province themselves had stumbled upon this family called the Jiang family in Huizhou that had kept kind of pretty good records of their tea business from the 19th century. And some of those documents were very useful for me. One of the earliest things I've written about this is the tea production aspect in China and how they use incense sticks to kind of time the labor of the workers and to kind of use it like a modern kind of, uh, you know, the way that sort of we kind of clock in, clock out in industrial economies. They would use this very traditional timekeeper of incense, kind of like an hourglass, and which seems kind of absurd, but they would use it in a very modern way to kind of make sure people's efficiency was high. And I found that from the Zhang family archives. I could not have made that argument really without those materials. And those were published, but I was also kind of went out of my way to kind of go there, see it with my own eyes, talk to the relatives of the family, who have no idea what I'm talking about because this is from the 19th century. But I did want to see it with my own eyes. And that did allow me to talk about a specific case study, let's say, of one family, one enterprise in China. The analog on the India side would not have been some sort of mom and pop shop, right? It would have been this large tea plantation run by a British multinational, basically. So for that, there were a lot of case studies out there. And, I went to Glasgow to look at one of them, and a lot of them are also available in the British Library, or a lot of them actually just write their own company history, and you could just read the book themselves. So yeah, the analogies, there's always like this Chinese equivalent to an British Indian equivalent, but they look very different at first. You have this East India Company on the one side versus this mom and pop tea factory on the other side. But if you think about these in kind of comparative terms, you can kind of perhaps see things you wouldn't otherwise see if you're only looking at one at a time.
Okay, thank you. I'll open up the. Oh, I think I've done something. Open up to the floor. I'll take two questions first. Maybe from Rija Nair and Aparajita Sarkar. You have two questions. Maybe we'll take two together, then we can maybe fit in more questions. Would you go ahead, Rija, first, and then Aparajita? And please keep your questions brief. Go ahead.
Hello, ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for an interesting presentation. So I just had one question. I mean, it's on the labor recruitment practices in both the countries. Do you see any kind of similarity in India and China regarding the labor recruitment practices?
Okay.
And if time allows, if I could ask another question, it's about the labor laws in both the countries. Like how is the tea industry kind of shaping the labor laws in both India and China? If you have discussed this in the book.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And Aparajita, you want to come in?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I'm interested in the way looking at the category of nations and who's defining the nation on both sides of the markets. And however much you try to avoid the competitive narrative, you can't. It comes in.
Sure.
So, like, even if you circumvent it. So what is that tension? Is it productive for you or not? Yeah. And also elite. There are elite networks that are, as you said, there is a corporate way of producing tea, and then there are the family companies. So how are you dealing with that difference of scale in terms of ownership? Mm-hmm. And does that affect proletization thereby, like labor laws, labor conditions?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Andrew, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so thank you. These are great questions. So Rita's question about penal or recruitment systems, the literature basically makes this assumption that, again, these are two very different systems. And I think my argument is, yes, there's very different on some level, but there's also a lot of similarities that are not, that don't get talked about. So famously in India, you have these penal labor laws I mentioned before, where if they're able to get these workers, these quote unquote coolies, to sign contracts, they can be under threat of criminal punishment or bound to their workers. So it's kind of almost like a slave plantation. It's an unfree plantation. And so but underneath that layer, sort of the unfree system versus the free system, there are some similarities, right? There's, in terms of the way labor is organized, both of them have a gender division of labor, where women workers are kind of incorporated into an industry, which is kind of unusual at the time for all these industries to have both women and men workers side by side, and to have tasks kind of divided by gender. There's also an ethnic, I don't know if that's the correct word. There's an ethnic dimension, let's say, though, where particular groups are targeted as kind of specially targeted to be recruited. And this isn't that different than if you think about any industry in the world. People get hired and recruited through networks of friends they know or whatever, but at a more intense level, right? In India, there's a long history of the categorization of quote unquote Aboriginal or non-caste people in central India, the modern day of Chotanagpur, which is the modern day Jharkhand. Those people are kind of topologized so almost anthropologically as like naturally born manual labor, and they get they explicitly say like we would pay extra money to get recruits from that part of the region. But in China, you don't have anything like that, but you do have these networks where it's this particular town, people from this particular town are seen as the best tea makers, and they kind of migrate every spring and every winter to go to the tea factories 100 miles away. So they're not, so one system is kind of seen quote unquote unfree, one is free, but there are some similarities that I try to tease out that comparison can help us see. And the main difference in terms of how the difference of recruitment is, again, in India, because of these penal labor contracts, you have a lot of scandalous stories of recruiters basically tricking people, especially women, to sign these contracts because they know once you sign the contract, you can't leave, even if you didn't intend to, sign away 5 years of your life. And there's debate about, whether or not these stories are kind of played up and mythologized, or if they're real or not. But there's, there's colonial testimonies and all that stuff. Aprajita's question about the nation. This is a good question. These questions that you raise about nation and comparison and scale, these are all things I actually try to historicize, especially in the second half of the book. So in terms of nation, I think to kind of clarify what I'm arguing, or my approach is to, like you said, kind of sidestep this question of nation by looking at processes that are at the same time subnational. So I'm not talking about all of China and all of India. I'm looking at these particular regions, Assam in India, Fujian and Anhui in China, but also transnational, right? And in many ways, Assam and Fujian have more in common with each other than they have in common with the rest of India or China, right? Because they're both kind of engaged in this international competition. But then this question of nationalism is inevitable. In the second half of the book, I try to tell this, I don't use this word, but like alternative history of nationalism, the emergence of nationalist thought in China and India. And I think a lot of it was motivated by economic nationalism, or motivated by competition. The competition inevitably, economic competition, capitalist competition, produces the sense of the outside world versus the inside world. In particular, so in China you have, well, the story in India is about how Indian intellectuals especially feel like the British tea planters are exploiting their people, and this becomes the basis for the call to take over the tea industry. And that's the story of economic nationalism, at least the Indian nationalism, that's by the 1920s is kind of a well-known story. But the basis, a lot of the it's not really well known that Indian tea was actually one of the first celebrity cause celeb for the Indian nationalists. So it does eventually get absorbed into the nationalist movement. And then in China, similarly, the fall from grace of the Chinese tea industry leads to its own set of reformers in China who call for the reorganization of the tea trade. And this perhaps gets at your question about elite networks and scale. In China, it was very quote unquote decentralized and scattered compared to the Indian tea industry. So there is a call by the nationalist reformers to have some sort of national organization that oversees everything, coordinates and rationalizes everything. That also gets absorbed into this economic nationalism. And I think economic nationalism, especially in China and India, is really just really about targeting European imperialism, seeing European imperialism as the enemy, and therefore wanting to nationalize the economy as a way to fight imperialism. So what happens with tea in China, it's not identical with, but I think is parallel to eventually the communist movement, right? The idea that we need to rationalize and nationalize the economy in order to stave off imperialism. And the people I look at, they're not part of the Communist Party, but they are sympathetic to it, and they eventually actually work in the communist government in the 1950s and 60s, which gives you a sense of, I think what that gives you a sense of is the flexibility of what happens in China, where some people are, but anyway, gives you a sense of sort of the overall. I do connect the story to the overall nationalist movements, but I historicize it instead of trying to take for granted that these are nation states, right?
Okay, thank you. We'll take another pair of questions. One from Professor Manoranjan Mohanty and one from Amitav Banik. I think you've raised your hand. Yeah. If we could go ahead with Professor Mohanty first.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I look forward to reading the book. Would you consider Amalendu Guha, the economic historian, an exception to your characterization of economic history? Because he does take into account the kind of issues you are raising. Now, that was a comment, but my question is about the comprador bourgeoisie. Because in China, was the comprador bourgeoisie visible and active in the tea industry? My suspicion is less than in the other industries. And in India, colonial administration, both East India Company and later, directly enforced this indentured labor system, as well as the administration of this semi-feudal, or whatever you call it. And therefore, when you say competition is the key of capitalism, I would put it differently as accumulation strategy, which is different in the two settings. Your comments.
Yeah.
And Amitav Banik?
Yes, thank you, Andrew, for your nice presentation on your book. My question is regarding that you mentioned in your presentation that the tea industry had been traditionally a more labor-intensive industry rather than being a very technologically driven industry. So, what do you think is the reason that traditionally it had been like that? And what is the tangle? Means, is it more of regarding more about exploitation of labor, or is it more about that more more employability, or what is actually the tangle there between capitalism, technology, and labor? And second question is about
can we keep one question, please, because there are others in the queue. So
okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So Professor Mohanty, Amalanda Guha is actually very useful also for my research. So when I talk about economic historians, I'm actually referring to, I would say luckily for him, he was working so early in the 60s and 70s that he kind of escapes the sort of econometric takeover of history. And I do think he's very much of a old-fashioned nationalist in some ways, but a lot of his basic data and arguments are useful. But I think he is one of the people who kind of argues that Indian tea is feudal and pre-capitalist, because I think he is kind of that earlier generation of stages of history, right? But he's very useful, and I use his work a lot. In terms of your questions, first about the comprador being active, this is actually something I take up. The very last chapter of the book is a intellectual history of this category of the comprador. The comprador, for those who don't know, comprador is this word that's used. Eventually, it kind of means collaborator or trader, like the Chinese or the Indian merchant who collaborates with the European imperialist. And I ask this question, what does this category, where does it come from? Because in the 18th and 19th century, the Chinese merchant who sells tea is either seen in neutral terms or even in positive terms in Chinese history. Like if those who know about the self-strengthening movement, it was about how Chinese merchants helped lead the country into modernization. But then by the 20th century, the very same people who are kind of seen as the vanguard of China are now seen as traders and collaborators with imperialism. So something radically has happened in terms of how do people in China perceive these merchants, the tea merchants in particular. The classic case of the comprador were those who sold silk and tea to the rest of the world. So I tried to argue in that last chapter to conceptualize the fact that these merchants go from kind of heroes of the Canton Kohong system of the 18th century to compradors by the 20th century. It's not so much that the merchants themselves did anything wrong, it's that these ideas about the economy have begun to change in China. And that in a very, to use a problematic word, in a very modern way. They become much more attuned to industrial ways of thinking, where the merchant, instead of being seen as progressive, is now seen as parasitic on an industrial economy. So that I actually kind of take comprador as an object of analysis itself, and that's the last chapter. In terms of the indentured labor system, competition. Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean, accumulation is certainly the way that I would think about when I say competition. What I guess I want to point out is accumulation is certainly a part of it. I've seen other authors use the phrase competitive accumulation, and that's fine with me. I do think accumulation is a key category. What I'm trying to point out with competition, though, is that in histories of capitalism, I think what kind of gets left unanswered is why all of a sudden in the 18th and 19th century are people basically working like hell to make as much as possible, to make as much money as possible. It isn't something you do because you're just born this way. It's because of these social pressures, these social dynamics of being kind of forced to depend upon the marketplace and therefore in competition with others who are dependent upon the marketplace. So it's really about how the market mediates this sense of each side pushing each other to make as much as possible, to make things as efficiently as possible. So it's really underlying the history of competition is a history of integration and creating a global division of labor that pits everyone against one another. I think without that, then you can't really account for the novelty of the modern period. Amitabh's question about technology and labor. Yeah, so this gets us into, I discussed this with regards to mechanization in India. This gets us into like history of technology questions about what is technology, like what is technology? We kind of think of what is science? How do people invent things? The old model, of course, is that you had geniuses like Newton or something who just kind of one day decided to invent a machine. But of course, that old model is kind of seems very old-fashioned these days. I think the argument that I like, that most historians of technology like, is that these things are always a product of their times and always a product of society itself. And in particular, if you look at the way that machines were built for the tea industry, but probably for many other industries, they first have to take human labor itself, human activity, break it down, and kind of almost make the human into a machine, right? So in terms of, let's say, the activity of rolling a tea leaf, you have to break it down and rationalize it in such a way that the humans are basically a rolling machine, where they just do this all day long to roll the tea leaf. And once you break down the labor process into, instead of one person making tea, it's like 20 discrete movements, 20 discrete simple tasks in the division of labor to make tea, then you've simplified the process and you've made it possible, therefore, for a machine to also do this instead, right? So most of the tea making process can still be human-based, but gradually, this task, that task, this task, if you've simplified it enough and subdivided it enough, can be replaced by a very basic and crude machine. So at this point, we certainly are not in the age of automation, right, where machines kind of take over for all of human activity. It's very much about humans are in control, but very gradually you have these human replacing tasks. But the first step in that process is to make the human itself kind of this object of management and discipline, rather than the subject that kind of makes the product by themselves.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take just 3 final questions together, and because we are running out of time, and you can answer them. Major General Chakravarti first, and then Anand, PK Anand, and then Cherry Kunjeria. These 3 people. So we'll start with Major General Chakravarti, please, and then.
Thank you very much, Professor Madhavi. My question to you is, I've been to the tea gardens of both Bengal and Assam, and also to the Nilgiris. Very lucky to have seen, and also I went to, Kunming in China, and since I was posted in Hanoi. I found one thing, while in our case, the Indian case, since you've been to Calcutta and I'm a Bengali, all right, the labor is extremely still in a deprived state. Whereas I was surprised in China that, the manager and the labor, they were having a great teamwork. And how is this synergy being brought out socially as well as economically?
Thank you. Can we have Anand?
I too wanted to ask a question if possible. I've been asking from the beginning.
Oh, he can go ahead. Yeah, he can go ahead. Yeah.
Is that,
Deepak.
Yes.
Yeah, he can manage. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I have been to Hangzhou, seen the tea museum, which is the history of 2,000 years, and shows the history of tea in China over the last 2,000 years. I've visited gardens in Hangzhou, the main tea producing region of China. And of course, 4 generations, my in-laws have been in the tea business in India for the last 100 plus years. There's some very interesting differences between the Chinese tea system and Indian tea system. But in China, the production of tea remained with the Chinese. But in India, the entire industry, from production to sales to marketing to everything else, was under enormously large British tea companies. So the pattern of production, development, sales, etc., were distinct and different in both these. The British system was also replicated in Colombo and, of course, South India, as Jan Chakrabarti has mentioned. Now, essentially, as you quite rightly mentioned, the tea production under the British colonial system was essentially a part of a slave labor economy. We have tried to differentiate it by saying indentured labor and things like that, but they were essentially slave labor as practiced by the colonial countries of that era. And that introduced the difference in the commercial proposition as well as the social dimension of the entire tea industry. Now, in India, of course, the problem remains that because of this, and this uh, commercialization was because of the British companies, very large companies. They owned enormous areas of land where tea was planted. Labor was brought from faraway places, essentially tribal labor, which were not really attuned to the modern conditions of living, etc., etc. And they were slaves, just like the slaves in the US South for the sugarcane plantation came from Africa. Indian labor once again went to Fiji, went to the West Indies, similar purposes, similar objective. Now, I think the challenge that the tea industry faces in India is that this has to modernize, and this whole labor relationship has not sufficiently modernized to suit the modern conditions. Whereas in the China, because the production and preparation of tea is essentially a family-owned farming enterprise, the commercialization and exploitation of the commercial values of the tea is left to the companies, and now, of course, Chinese companies, earlier the British companies. Now, where do you think the differences continue between India and China in their tea enterprises and also competition for the tea market? Because at one time, tea was an extremely profitable enterprise. 19th century was called, tea was called as black gold, like many other things. It is losing its commercial prospects because of all the new beverages that are now flooding the markets. So, what do you think is the future for tea as an industry, both in India and China?
Okay, Andrew, would you take these two questions together and then we'll have the last pair of questions, okay?
Yeah, I think these questions are kind of similar from Professor Chakrabarti and Professor Banerjee. I think Professor Banerjee kind of answers the first question, that the major difference, right, is that the Indian industry, my understanding after independence, is basically a British plantation system gets inherited by Indian planters and managers. And I was only, and here I'm speculating because I'm not an expert on contemporary conditions, but from what I'd seen when I visited and looking at pictures of it, it basically looks like a very similar system to that of the 19th century, almost by default. Like, it would have taken, like, why, like, they're not going to create new infrastructure and redo the land. It was an inherited system, whereas the Chinese system is, it was never nearly as rigid as like a plantation system. Like, as you said, it was mostly always a family system. They didn't clear lots of land to grow tea as such. It was always sort of like this crop, that crop was on the family plots. Then you have, of course, the Communist Revolution, and the current tea industry of China, my understanding is not continuous with the 19th and early 20th century. I think the missing story here is that in this mid 20th century, much of the 20th century, Chinese export teas basically disappear from the picture. India has taken over. Ceylon, Sri Lanka is also a big player. And then it's the other British industries, such as Kenya, that also become major players in the global tea trade. In the meantime, China is kind of going through its, well-known, warlord period, and then Civil War, then World War II, and then Communist Revolution. Tea eventually rebounds in the 1980s and 90s, but it's under this new, under a new system, let's say from the 1970s onwards, where a lot of the plants, my understanding is a lot of the plants, a lot of the fields, a lot of the factories for making tea in China today can date back really to the 70s and the 80s. And it's part of, this obvious, this push to commercialize and internationalize and liberalize the Chinese economy. So today, in terms of where do things stand today, superficially, things look very similar to the way they looked 100 years ago. The two top tea producers in the world are China and India, once again. But as Professor Banerjee was just saying, it's tea is not very profitable like it once was. I think tea was probably most profitable and most relevant to the global economy in the 19th century, the time I'm looking at. Obviously now we have much more advanced and high value goods that dominate, like computers and oil and cars, right? So tea is always like this primary commodity that's never going to be that valuable. And again, the difference is though, in terms of where things go from here, it's not very profitable. I've read about kind of cost cutting measures that are being taken by all sides. The mechanization, despite these fantasies of the 19th century, tea can never really be mechanized that much. They've kind of pushed that to its limit, and they can't really save any more money with further mechanization. In fact, one way they've kind of tried to cut costs in India, I've read, is that they've actually decentralized and asked people to grow their own tea, and then bring that tea to the factory, and the tea in the factory will manufacture it for them. So this is, very similar to the sort of informalization and flexible process that we've seen all around the world, the sort of the decentralization of Fordist systems. The one thing that's interesting is tea, because of this new jumbled marketplace, I think the target audience for tea is not, it's not Western Europe and the United States, although it could be with the like bottled tea or tea lattes. It's Asia. Like now that Asia is becoming richer and you have more of a middle class across Asia, in India and China and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan, the tea industry is kind of targeting Asian middle class consumers as the next kind of big consumer targets. And then you have a lot of niche markets for, there's tea lattes, then there's fancy artisanal teas, and there's black tea, and there's green tea. And so we see the sort of subdivision of tea into all these sort of specialty niches to cater to an increasingly richer clientele in Asia itself. So I think that's one major change from the 19th century, when it's about Asia selling tea to Western Europe and the northern and the United States. Okay. Sorry, that was kind of rambling, but.
Thank you. And we'll take the last two questions. PK Anand and Cherry Kuncheria. Anand, go first, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Andrew, for that presentation. I'll keep my questions very simple, because you had mentioned it also towards the end of your presentation that you also have gone through a lot of vernacular literature in terms of stories, novels, poems, other things about the lives of tea workers, especially in India. So I was just trying to understand, was there also in your book and in your own study, have you been able to come across as some kind of work associations or labor associations within the tea industry? I mean, I understand that one is an endangered system, the other is family-owned system. But how was the nature of these associations, and how were these associations speaking to the producers, and especially with the British, how was their interaction, and how did that puzzle sort of, or jigsaw sort of, fit into this entire puzzle of global production and supply?
Okay, thank you. And the last question.
Thanks very much. This has been a very fascinating talk, and I've been reading your book. And one of the good things about it is that it forces me to rethink my own work. So it's a bad thing in one sense, but also a good thing in other ways. So the question I had to ask you is that while I was reading your book, I was struck at the fact that there's one dimension which seems to be curiously missing, rather two dimensions. The first is about the ecological aspect, about how does the ecological aspect shape particular regimes of labor and labor conditions, which is something that Arnab Dey, for instance, does for Assam. So I was curious to know, how does this work both in China as well as in a transnational, transregional perspective? The second thing, I don't know whether you've done it in your book and I have not reached it yet, is about the idea of consumption. Now, how do particular ways of consumption, whether it's being consumed in a particular way for local markets or for export, shape particular ways in which production happens and therefore labor is organized. And I'm thinking here in particular about, say, the work on chocolate by Emma Robertson between Roe and Tree and between Ghana and cocoa bean production. So I'm wondering about whether these things actually matter in your perspective about how labor itself is conceived, organized, managed, recruited even, and how the political economy is thought of and conceived by the various actors both in China as well as in India. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, please.
Yeah. So to answer the first question by PK Anand, the labor associations, this is a history in the India side. There is a creation of labor unions by the 1930s, and it's quite late in my story, so I don't talk about it too much. I think in both sides, what's interesting is you don't really have labor as such fighting for itself. What you really have are the causes of labor being taken up by nationalists. And then eventually you do get labor associations. That kind of is after the end of my story. But I think a question I'm interested in this is, it's almost like a conceptual history. How does the category of labor become itself something that's worth talking about and describing as its own thing? And the fact that labor does become its own thing worth talking about, to me, again, is a reflection of the way that these are societies increasingly organized around production, commodity production, labor productivity, and labor as the basis for economic activity. And that is distinctive. That is new in the 19th and 20th century. That is one of the things, that is one of the hallmarks of classical political economy in Western Europe. And one of the things that I think puts China and India into conversation with the rest of the industrial world, that they are taking labor seriously. In terms of how it gets politicized, though, it's mostly through nationalist associations. The INC in India takes up labor. They write these novels, this, as you mentioned, vernacular, but also English language literature about labor. But the conclusion is not, therefore, we need unions and socialism. The conclusion is mostly, we need Indian ownership of these tea plantations to fight for, because Indian owners and Indian workers would somehow, it's assumed, right, they would somehow be on the same side when, if you take labor and capital problems seriously, they're not obviously on the same side at all, right? But that is how it initially gets posed. And the same thing in China, the labor is a problem, tea labor, tea peasantry gets posed as a economic problem, but the political translation is in terms of cooperatives and having peasant cooperatives, because labor there is very rarely seen as just labor. It's about peasants who also produce labor, but also work as workers in the factory, et cetera. So it's about cooperatives would somehow reduce the impact of European capital if somehow the peasants could pool together the resources and control the funding and the marketing and the distribution. So labor is a political problem, but it gets really converted into these kind of nationalist basically nationalist, anti-imperialist organizations rather than unions as such, the way we would think about unions. To the second questions from Kuncheria, the first question about ecology, that's a good question. So again, I could tell you, Arnab obviously talks about it in Chinese history, and Osborne has talked about it. I don't take it as a problem. I think I do pay attention to the materiality of tea production and its relationship to the environment. I don't really pose it as a problem, let's say, of ecological decline, though, because I feel like that's a little anachronistic a way of thinking about it. But I guess I'd be more interested in, to what extent does competition and production, how does this make people aware of the natural conditions, the natural limitations that are placed upon tea production, right? Because tea, unlike again, an urban industry where things are sort of controlled for, tea is a living thing, a plant that survives under specific natural conditions. And there is a lot of discussion about how tea can thrive only in this part of Assam, but not this other part of India. Tea can only thrive in the mountains of China, but not in other parts of China. So that is, I think, certainly part of the discussion about how do these regions emerge in the first place. They're not just chosen at random. And again, this question of how does consumption shape production, the clearest example is the story of black tea, which I do talk about in the book, and the history of green tea, oolong tea, and black tea. These are, like, tea in China at the time was always, they didn't call it green tea, it was just tea, right? And it was basically what we would call a green tea. There eventually emerges this thing known as oolong tea in Fujian, which is kind of a semi-oxidized tea. It's kind of dark, but not that dark. And then what we know today is black tea. In China and Japan, it's called red tea, like hongcha. And that is a very oxidized, very dark, very strong, very bitter version of tea that is basically the product of British intervention. It is overseas British and American consumers who like actually just British, not Americans like green tea. The British like black tea because it goes well with sugar and milk, and sugar is a big, commodity for feeding the working classes of Western Europe. And black tea has more caffeine, so that kind of energizes the working classes of Western Europe. It is because of the British taste for black tea that kind of gets boomerangs back into China that leads to the creation of black tea industries in China. And even today in China, I don't think people realize that what they call, hongcha, red tea, they just consider it Chinese, another version of tea in China. They don't really realize that the origins are colonial in origin, or I don't know if colonial is the right word, global in origin, that it was a tea that was considered bitter and not very good tasting in Asia, but because it was so marketable to Western Europe, whole parts of China, starting in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, no one is quite sure when red tea begins, but it's certainly in response to overseas markets rather than to domestic taste. And then, of course, Assam is almost entirely black tea, right? Darjeeling makes some green tea, but the Assam industry is founded upon this idea of creating cheap, affordable, strong, bitter black teas that are for the British market, that are for that is to be drunk with milk and sugar, right? And so those consumption habits certainly shape production, and I talk about that. In terms of how do English people like tea in the first place, Erica Rappaport has written a book about British tea consumption habits that I think might answer that question on the European side.
Okay, with this, I think we can conclude this session. And I apologize to anybody whom I could not accommodate in this questions, but we have sort of reached the end of our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. You've given us so much to think about, whether it's the tea industries in both places, or capitalism, or labor, or competition. All these, big themes, a lot to think about. And you've also whetted our appetite to read your full book whenever we can get our hands on it. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. And with this, we'll close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions and for the invitation and spending time listening to me talk.
Thank you.